In the late 1980s, Japan looked unstoppable. Its companies were buying American landmarks. Its banks dominated global finance. Its factories set the standard for quality, efficiency, and discipline. Economists openly predicted that Japan would soon surpass the United States as the world's leading economic power. Tokyo glowed. Capital flowed. Confidence felt permanent. Then the growth stopped. Not for a year. Not for a recession. But for decades. Japan did not collapse. It froze. And the reason was not culture, demographics, or bad luck. It was debt created during the greatest asset bubble the modern world had ever seen. To understand how that bubble destroyed Japan's future, you first have to understand why Japan became powerful in the first place. Because the bubble did not grow out of chaos. It grew out of a system that had once worked extraordinarily well. After the Second World War, Japan rebuilt itself with discipline rather than spectacle. The country had few natural resources and little room for error. Survival depended on exports. Firms had to compete globally or fail. Waste was punished. Efficiency was rewarded. Banks, corporations, and the state worked together. Credit was not allocated randomly. It was directed. Long-term relationships replaced short-term profit. Companies borrowed to invest, not to speculate. Growth came from production. Factories expanded. Skills accumulated. Wages rose slowly, but steadily. Savings were high. Debt was manageable. Risk was controlled. Japan's strength was coordination. For decades, this model delivered results. Japanese cars, electronics, and machinery conquered global markets. Trade surpluses grew. Confidence grew with them. By the early 1980s, Japan was no longer rebuilding. It was dominating. That success created a new problem. Japan's exports flooded foreign markets, especially the United States. Trade tensions rose. Political pressure mounted. Something had to change. In 1985, it did. Through an international agreement, major economies acted to weaken the US dollar. The Japanese yen surged in value. Almost overnight, Japan's exports became more expensive. While the very mechanism that had powered growth now threatened it. The Bank of Japan faced a dilemma. Allow the economy to slow or offset the shock. It chose offset. Interest rates were cut. Credit was loosened. Lending surged. The goal was not speculation. It was stabilization. Cheaper money would protect exporters. Domestic demand would fill the gap, but cheap credit changes behavior. Banks, flush with liquidity, began lending aggressively. Corporations discovered that borrowing was easy. Land prices rose. Stocks climbed. Assets appreciated faster than output. What began as a policy adjustment became a structural shift. Land took on a new role. In Japan, land was not just property. It was collateral. As prices rose, balance sheets expanded. Rising asset values allowed firms to borrow more. Borrowing more pushed prices higher. The loop fed itself. This did not feel dangerous. It felt logical. Everyone appeared richer. Paper wealth multiplied. Office buildings in Tokyo were valued higher than entire countries. Companies used inflated assets to justify expansion. Banks accepted land as security without question. Risk was no longer assessed. It was assumed away. Credit had stopped disciplining behavior. It had begun protecting it. The culture of production gave way quietly to a culture of valuation. Success was measured not by output, but by asset prices. Profit mattered less than appreciation. Debt was no longer a temporary tool. It became a permanent fixture of balance sheets. And because this was Japan, orderly, regulated, disciplined, the danger was invisible. There was no frenzy, no chaos, no obvious recklessness, just numbers rising. From the outside, Japan looked invincible. From the inside, the economy was being rewired around assets instead of productivity. Wealth existed on paper. Debt existed in reality. And reality was being deferred. By the end of the 1980s, Japan was no longer powered by factories and exports. It was powered by collateral and confidence. The system still looked strong. Its growth still appeared healthy. Dead beneath the surface, the economy had crossed a line. Debt had replaced growth. Assets had replaced income. And when that shift happens, the future becomes fragile. The moment the prices stopped rising, the system would have to face what it had become. That moment was coming. By the late 1980s, Japan's economy no longer revolved around production. It revolved around prices. Credit was everywhere. Interest rates were low. Banks were encouraged to lend. Regulators looked on approvingly. What had begun as stabilization policy had quietly turned into fuel. At first, the lending made sense. Companies borrowed to expand. Developers borrowed to build. Land prices rose steadily, then quickly. Rising prices justified larger loans. Larger loans pushed prices higher. Balance sheets inflated without effort. No one felt reckless. Everyone felt prudent. In Japan's financial system, land had always been considered safe. It did not disappear. It did not default. It had cultural and economic permanence. As prices rose, banks accepted land as collateral almost automatically. Lending decisions became mechanical. This changed the logic of the economy. Firms no longer needed strong cash flow to borrow. They needed assets. As long as land values rose, debt could be rolled forward. Losses could be hidden. Risk could be postponed. Credit stopped acting as a filter and became a blanket. Stock markets followed. Share prices surged as corporations cross-held equity through keiretsu networks. Rising stock values strengthened balance sheets. Stronger balance sheets justified more borrowing. Borrowing pushed markets higher still. The system fed on itself. Office towers in Tokyo were valued at levels that defied comparison. Entire districts were priced higher than whole nations. These numbers circulated without disbelief. They were printed in reports, discussed in meetings, and absorbed into planning. The bubble did not feel like a bubble. There was no hysteria, no panic buying, no crowds shouting in the streets. There were only spreadsheets. Executives watched asset values rise and concluded they were managing well. Bankers saw expanding collateral and believed risk was shrinking. Policymakers saw growth figures and assumed success. Everyone had an incentive to believe the story. The incentives mattered. Banks earned fees by lending. Corporations preserved face by refinancing. Regulators avoided confrontation by trusting the system. Nobody wanted to be the one who questioned the numbers, because questioning the numbers meant questioning the entire structure, and the structure was now enormous. By the end of the decade, Japan's asset prices had detached completely from economic reality. Land was no longer valued by its income potential, but by expectation. Stocks were priced not on profit, but on permanence. Debt was no longer something to be repaid. It was something to be maintained. The economy had entered a new phase. Growth no longer came from innovation or output. It came from balance sheet expansion. As long as asset prices rose, the illusion held. The moment they stopped, the illusion would collapse. That moment arrived quietly. Concerned about speculation, the Bank of Japan began tightening policy. Interest rates rose modestly. Lending slowed. The change was incremental, but the system was no longer resilient. Asset prices stopped rising. That was enough. Once prices plateaued, the loop reversed. Collateral values stagnated. New loans became harder to justify. Refinancing slowed. Balance sheets froze in place. Then prices began to fall. What disappeared first was confidence. Stocks fell sharply. Land prices followed. The paper wealth that had supported the system evaporated. But the debt remained. Loans issued at peak valuations were still owed in full. Collateral shrank beneath them. Japan had entered a balance sheet recession. Corporations did not respond by investing. They responded by surviving. Cash flow was diverted to debt repayment. Expansion plans were canceled. Hiring slowed. Risk vanished. Even profitable firms stopped behaving like growth engines. S-banks, facing enormous losses, did not fail openly. They concealed them. Bad loans were rolled over. Solvent borrowers were kept alive. Losses were postponed in the hope that prices would recover. They did not. The bubble economy had turned into a frozen economy. Credit existed, but no one wanted it. Money was cheap, but no one borrowed. Problem was no longer liquidity. It was fear. Balance sheets were wounded, and healing them became the only priority. Japan had not crashed like a crisis economy. It had stalled like a patient refusing to move. The asset bubble had not destroyed Japan's wealth in one moment. It had destroyed its willingness to take risk. And once risk disappears, growth does too. As by the early 1990s, Japan was no longer booming. But it was not recovering either. The country had entered the long silence that would define its future. When Japan's bubble finally burst, there was no single moment of collapse. There were no bank runs, no mass bankruptcies, no dramatic panic. Instead, the economy entered a long, grinding process of denial. Asset prices kept falling. Land values declined year after year. Stock markets never recovered their peak. The paper wealth that had inflated balance sheets in the 1980s was gone, but the debts built on that wealth remained. This created a new kind of crisis. Japanese companies were not bankrupt in the traditional sense. Many were still profitable in day-to-day operations. But their balance sheets were broken. Assets were worth less than liabilities. Equity had vanished. The goal was no longer growth. It was repair. Firms stopped investing. They stopped expanding. Stopped taking risk. Every yen of cash flow was diverted toward paying down debt. Even when interest rates fell to zero, borrowing made no sense. The problem was not the cost of money. It was the weight of past decisions. This is what economists later called a balance sheet recession. In a normal recession, lower rates encourage borrowing. In Japan, lower rates changed nothing. Companies were not constrained by access to credit. They were constrained by fear. They did not want more debt. They wanted less. Banks faced the same paralysis. Japanese banks were sitting on mountains of bad loans. If they recognized those losses openly, many would collapse. So they chose concealment. Loans were rolled over, insolvent firms were kept alive, losses were postponed year after year in the hope that asset prices would recover. They never did. The result was an economy filled with zombie banks and zombie companies, institutions that survived but did not grow. They absorbed capital. They blocked competition. They prevented renewal. Japan did not experience creative destruction. It experienced creative paralysis. The government responded with stimulus. Spending programs were launched. Infrastructure projects were approved. Public debt soared. The state tried to replace private demand with public demand. Roads were built. Bridges were built. Money flowed. But the effect was temporary. Stimulus could stabilize the economy, but it could not revive animal spirits. Companies still refused to invest. Banks still refused to write off losses. Households saved instead of spending. Deflation set in. Prices fell slowly, relentlessly. Deflation is not dramatic. It is corrosive. When prices fall, people delay purchases. When people delay purchases, businesses delay investment. When investment is delayed, wages stagnate. Expectations adjust downward. Japan entered a psychological trap. People stopped believing tomorrow would be better than today. This is why recovery never arrived. The lost decades were not caused by demographics alone. Aging came later. They were not caused by lack of innovation. Japan remained technologically advanced. They were caused by a system trapped by its past. Debt from the bubble years acted like gravity. Every attempt to move forward was pulled back by balance sheets that could not be cleared without admitting failure. Political leaders hesitated. Bank regulators delayed. Corporate culture avoided confrontation. Stability was preserved at the cost of dynamism. Japan chose order over disruption, and that choice froze the economy in place. Many countries experienced bubbles. Few experienced stagnation this long. The difference was how Japan handled the aftermath. Losses were not forced out of the system quickly. Banks were not recapitalized aggressively. Insolvent firms were not cleared. The economy was allowed to survive, but not to reset. The bubble had rewired incentives. Risk became something to avoid at all costs. Failure became unacceptable. Even when conditions improved, behavior did not. Japan had not lost its wealth in one crash. It had lost its future momentum. This is why Japan's story matters. Our asset bubbles do not simply burst and disappear. They leave behind debt structures that poison time. They turn growth economies into maintenance economies. They replace optimism with caution. When asset prices rise faster than income, debt fills the gap. When the prices fall, the debt remains. And when debt dominates decision-making, recovery becomes optional, not automatic. Japan did everything economists recommended. It cut rates. It spent money. It stabilized banks. Still, it stagnated because the real damage was not financial. It was psychological. The bubble taught an entire generation that risk leads to ruin, and an economy without risk cannot grow. Japan did not fall from power in a single moment. It stepped carefully into a future it could not escape. The bubble did not destroy Japan's economy. It locked it in place. That is the true cost of asset bubbles. They do not just collapse wealth, they collapse time.